She arrived earlier than most people that evening. The building was already lit from the inside, warm yellow lights glowing through tall glass windows. From the outside, it looked like a place where only important people belonged. Expensive cars stopped one by one at the entrance. Well-dressed guests stepped out, laughing softly, checking their phones, adjusting coats, and greeting each other with confident smiles. She walked in quietly from the side gate. Her steps were slow, not because she was unsure, but because she liked to observe. She carried no instrument, no special bag, nothing that showed she was connected to music at all. Her clothes were clean but simple. Nothing stood out. No one looked at her twice. Inside, the hall smelled faintly of polished wood and old books. The ceiling was high, decorated with soft lights that reflected off the shiny floor. A grand piano stood in the center, black and flawless, like it was placed there for someone important. Around it, chairs were arranged neatly. Filling up quickly with people who spoke in calm but confident voices, she paused near the entrance and took it all in. This place was not new to her dreams, but it was new to her reality. For years, she had imagined halls like this while practicing alone in small rooms, old houses, and borrowed spaces. She had pictured bright lights, quiet audiences, and a piano that responded perfectly to every touch. But now that she was actually there, the feeling was different, heavier, real. She moved toward the back, choosing a seat no one else wanted. From there, she could see everything without being seen. People around her discussed performances they had seen in other cities, famous names and techniques only trained ears could understand. Some spoke about music like it was a competition, something to be owned, judged, and ranked. She listened, but said nothing. A staff member walked past her and nodded politely. Assuming she was just another guest or helper, that was fine. She did not correct them. She was used to being misunderstood. It had happened her whole life. Her mind drifted back for a moment, not in clear memories, but in feelings. Cold mornings. Long nights. Fingers sore from practice. The sound of cheap keys that never stayed in tune. Being told to lower the volume. Being told to stop dreaming. Being told music was not a real future. She had learned early that explaining herself was pointless. Around her, the hall slowly filled. The front rows were taken by people with sharp eyes and confident posture. These were the ones whose opinions mattered here. The ones who could decide if a performance was worth it or not. They spoke softly, but there was judgment in every word. She watched them with calm eyes. The event was meant to be special. An evening where selected performers would play short pieces for a small but powerful audience. Invitations were limited. Standards were high. Mistakes were not forgiven easily. Everyone knew this. What most people did not know was how close she had come to not being there at all. Her chance had arrived quietly, almost by accident. A short conversation, a listening ear. Someone who noticed her playing in a place where no one else bothered to stop. No promises were made. Just a simple sentence, "Come tomorrow. There may be a piano." That was all. She did not know what she expected when she arrived, but she knew what she did not expect. She did not expect the looks, the confusion, the slight irritation in the air when her name appeared on the list, spoken without excitement or recognition. She heard whispers near the front earlier. Who is that? Is she part of the staff? Must be filling a slot. None of it surprised her. When the host stepped onto the stage to welcome everyone, the room grew quiet. Polite applause followed. The host spoke about the beauty of music, the importance of talent, and the honor of listening to true skill. Each sentence sounded perfect, practiced, and safe. She listened carefully, not to the words, but to the room. The piano waited in silence. As the first performer was announced, she leaned back slightly. She was not first. That was a relief. She liked to listen before playing. It helped her understand the mood, the expectations, and the weight of the moment. One by one, performers came and went. The audience reacted as expected. Soft applause, thoughtful nods, occasional smiles. Everything felt controlled, measured, safe. She clapped politely like everyone else. With each performance, the pressure inside her chest grew a little stronger. Not fear, but awareness. She knew she was different. Not better. Just different. Her relationship with music was not clean or academic. It was messy, emotional, personal. That difference had never been welcomed easily at one point. She looked down at her hands. They were steady, slightly worn. Not the hands people expected to see on that piano. She flexed her fingers gently, feeling the familiar calm return. Music had always been her place of truth. A break was announced. People stood, stretching, moving toward small tables at the side for drinks. Conversations started again, louder now. Judgments were shared more freely. She stayed seated. Someone nearby spoke without lowering their voice. So far, nothing surprising. Another replied, "That's expected here." She looked toward the piano again. From this distance, it looked almost unreal. Too perfect. Too untouched. She wondered how it would feel under her hands. Every piano had its own voice, its own mood. She had learned to listen quickly, to adjust, to connect. That skill had come from necessity, not training. The break ended. People returned to their seats. The room settled once more. Her turn was coming. She did not check the list again. She already knew. Instead, she focused on her breathing. Slow, quiet, controlled. She was not trying to impress anyone. She never played for that reason. She played because some emotions had no other way out. When her name was finally called, it landed in the room without weight. There was a pause. A few heads turned. Brows furrowed slightly. People looked around, trying to place the name with a face they recognized. When she stood up from the back row, the confusion became visible. She felt it immediately. The way eyes scanned her. The way expectations dropped before she took a single step. Someone near the aisle shifted uncomfortably. Another person leaned toward their neighbor. Whispering something with a faint smile, she walked forward anyway. Each step felt long. Not because she was nervous, but because the room felt thick with assumption. She kept her gaze level. Not challenging. Not apologetic. When she reached the piano, she paused. Up close, it was even more beautiful. The surface reflected the lights above. The bench was adjusted carefully, probably for someone taller, someone more expected. She adjusted it quietly, the sound echoing more than she liked. A few people shifted again in their seats. She sat down. For a moment, she did nothing. This was the moment where doubt usually tried to speak. It told her she did not belong, that she was out of place, that this room was not built for people like her. But she had heard those words. Before, she placed her hands lightly on the keys without pressing them. She closed her eyes just for a second. Not to escape, but to arrive fully. The room waited. Some with curiosity, most with quiet judgment. No one knew that this piano, this moment, was about to speak in a way they were not prepared for, and she was finally ready to let it speak through her. She took a deep breath and let her hands rest gently on the piano keys. The room had grown quiet again after the small stir her arrival had caused. A few people whispered to each other, trying to guess who she was or why she had been allowed to perform. Some looked impatient, tapping fingers against programs, glancing at watches. The energy was a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. She could feel it, but she did not let it reach her mind. Instead, she focused on the space in front of her, the piano, and the sounds she could imagine coming to life. The first moment at the keys was always the hardest. It was never about showing skill. It was about connection, connecting herself to the piano, to the music, and to the room. She placed her fingers lightly on the keys, feeling the texture under her fingertips, listening for the slight hum the instrument made. Every piano was different, and this one, despite its polished surface and grandeur, had a voice that wanted to be heard properly. She had learned, through years of practice and quiet observation, how to find it. Around her, the audience continued to watch. A few of the elite members exchanged looks, whispering words she couldn't hear. Their expressions were a mix of doubt and anticipation. They expected nothing remarkable. Some were already preparing to move on mentally, convinced that the next few minutes would be nothing more than polite entertainment. but she did not care about their expectations. She never had. Music for her had always been about truth that could not be hidden, truth that could not be ignored. The first note she pressed was soft, almost hesitant. It filled the hall in a way that was not loud but immediately noticeable. The sound was clean, the resonance delicate yet certain. Heads turned slightly, some faces showing the first signs of curiosity. A few leaned forward instinctively, as if drawn by something they could not name. The performance had not begun, yet the space around her already seemed to shift. The whispers ceased, replaced by an almost imperceptible tension, a quiet waiting. She continued, letting her fingers move naturally across the keys. The music grew slowly, like water filling a quiet room. She did not play fast or complex passages at first. Instead, she focused on feeling each note, letting her own emotions guide the rhythm and pace. Every movement, every sound, carried something personal, years of struggle. Moments of doubt, nights spent alone in small rooms practicing until her fingers ached. Each key she pressed was a part of her story, unspoken but alive in the music. People began to notice. At first, it was subtle, a tilt of the head, a pause in conversation. A hand held over the mouth as someone recognized the depth in the performance. Even the critics, who had been watching with slight smirks, stopped fidgeting. Their expressions changed slowly from mild amusement to focused attention. They did not know it yet, but something significant was unfolding. Something they had not anticipated. The music shifted slightly, becoming more expressive. She allowed a hint of melancholy to enter, a softness that suggested vulnerability but was not weak. The notes flowed with a natural rise and fall, creating tension and release that drew the listeners in. The room, once filled with polite observation, now seemed alive in response. It was as if the walls themselves were listening, resonating with the sound, capturing every nuance. The air felt different, heavier, fuller. The audience could feel it too, though many did not yet understand why. A man in the front row, someone who had been quietly judging the performers so far, shifted in his seat. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in recognition. Something in the music reminded him of forgotten emotions, of moments in life that had no words. He leaned closer, letting the sound wash over him, surprised by the clarity and honesty in every note. For the first time that evening, he did not feel superior. He felt challenged, not by skill, but by the raw sincerity of what he was hearing. She continued to play, her fingers moving effortlessly now. The music grew richer, more textured, with layers of emotion interwoven. There were moments of softness, almost fragile, followed by passages that were bold and confident. Every movement told a story. Every pause, every held note, carried meaning. She did not need to explain herself. The piano did it for her. The audience began to respond unconsciously. Some leaned forward, some closed their eyes, others let small gasps escape without thinking. It was impossible to remain indifferent to what was happening. A whisper broke somewhere in the back. A guest, someone who prided themselves on knowing all things musical, spoke to their neighbor. "Who is she?" The question hung in the air. No one had an answer. Everyone was too captivated to check. They only knew that what they were hearing was unlike anything they had expected. The sound was precise, yet it carried a humanity that technical skill alone could never achieve. It had depth. It had soul. Her hands moved with purpose. Each note had meaning. She had planned nothing in advance. Every movement came from instinct, from memory, from feeling. It was as if her life itself had taught her how to play this music in this way, at this exact moment. She had no audience in mind when she learned these pieces. No one to impress. And now, here, in a room full of people who considered themselves above surprises, her music spoke more clearly than words ever could. The tempo shifted slightly, flowing naturally with the emotions she was channeling. The audience felt the change without understanding why. A young woman near the center leaned forward, resting her chin on her hand, eyes wide. She had heard many performances, but none like this. It was not only about notes, technique, or even beauty. It was about honesty. The pianist was giving herself completely, leaving nothing hidden, yet nothing forced. It was impossible to look away. A man with glasses, sitting near the aisle, whispered to himself, "I have never heard anything like this before." His voice was quiet, but his tone carried awe. Around him, others began to notice subtle changes in their own reactions. They felt an unexpected connection, as if the music were pulling threads from their own experiences, memories, and emotions. Some of them tried to resist, trying to stay composed, but the sound filled the room, breaking through defenses. She paused briefly, allowing a single note to linger in the air. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of expectation, full of tension, full of lives holding their breath. Then she continued, building layers of melody that rose and fell like waves. Each movement told a story. Stories of longing, struggle, quiet victories, hidden pain, and hope that refused to die. It was a language everyone understood, even if they did not know the words. By now, the whispers had stopped completely. The audience was silent, completely absorbed. Even the people who had arrived with preconceived opinions found themselves swept away. They could no longer judge. They could no longer compare. They could only listen. And with every note, the room seemed to grow tighter, more intimate. As if the music was stitching the audience together with threads they did not see, her mind was clear, focused only on the connection between herself, the piano, and the emotions that had been waiting to escape for years. She did not notice the occasional tear, the tight grips on chair arms, or the subtle nods of acknowledgement. She did not need to. Music was enough. Music was always enough. And tonight, it was saying everything she could never put into words. The performance continued. Each note carefully yet naturally placed. She did not rush. She did not hesitate. She allowed every emotion its space, every silence its voice. The audience responded in ways they could not control. Some faces softened, others hardened, some leaned back in quiet reflection, and some closed their eyes completely, lost in the experience. She played not for applause, not for recognition, not for judgment, but for the pure expression of something deeply human. Finally, as the final measures approached, the music slowed. She allowed the notes to fade gently, softly, like sunlight disappearing behind a horizon. The last note lingered longer than expected, a gentle vibration that seemed to hang in the air, touching everyone present in ways that were impossible to ignore. She lifted her hands slowly, letting the silence settle around the room. For a brief moment, no one moved. No one breathed. No one dared break the spell. The room was heavy, but in a way that was full, complete, and undeniable. She opened her eyes. People looked back at her, unsure how to react. They had come expecting a performance, maybe some entertainment, maybe nothing at all. Instead, they had witnessed a truth so raw, so powerful, that words seemed unnecessary. Then the applause began. Small at first, hesitant, as if the audience was testing whether this was real. But it grew quickly, spreading through the hall like wildfire. Hands clapped, feet stamped softly on the floor, whispers of praise mixed with exclamations of awe. People rose from their seats, some slowly, some urgently, overcome by what they had heard. Even the critics, the ones who had arrived with pride and confidence, could not hold back their admiration. She remained seated, letting the sound wash over her. She did not smile. She did not bow. She simply breathed, feeling the release of emotion she had carried for so long. This was not about approval. This was about connection, about truth, about the ability of music to reach beyond appearances, beyond judgment, beyond expectation. And in that moment, she understood something clearly. The room had changed. The people in it had changed, not because of grandeur or prestige or wealth or titles, but because they had heard something real, something unguarded, something that could not be ignored or dismissed. And she, quietly, calmly, had given it to them. The night was far from over, but this moment the connection, the honesty, the undeniable humanity in her performance would remain long after the last note faded. And she, who had once been invisible, had become unforgettable. She sat there for a moment after the applause, letting it settle around her. The sound of clapping filled the hall, echoing softly against the high ceilings. But it was not the kind of recognition she had ever sought. She had never played for praise. She had played for truth, for release, for the music itself. And yet, she could feel it, every pair of eyes now fixed on her, some in awe, some in disbelief, all attentive. The atmosphere had changed completely. The polite distance that had once separated her from the audience had vanished, replaced by an invisible thread of curiosity and expectation. Her hands rested on her lap, trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the release of years of tension that had built with every practice session. Every moment she had been underestimated, every quiet night spent at the piano while the world went on around her. Music had always been her refuge, her only companion in times of doubt. And now it had become a language that everyone in this grand hall was beginning to understand. A few people shifted in their seats, exchanging glances. There was a sudden realization among them. This was not just a technical display, a performance to fill the evening with pleasant sounds. This was something deeper, something that carried emotion, story, life. For the first time that evening, the elite, who had come expecting to judge, were silent with attention, unsure how to measure what they had just experienced. She looked up briefly, scanning the audience with a calm, quiet gaze. Their expressions were varied: surprise, curiosity, awe, and even a hint of self-reflection. A man in the front row, who had been whispering opinions before, now sat motionless, as if he had forgotten to breathe. A woman near the center clutched the armrest lightly, her eyes wide, captivated by the subtle shifts in the music that seemed to mirror unspoken memories. These were people accustomed to evaluating, comparing, and deciding, yet in this moment, they were entirely without words. She returned her attention to the piano. The first notes of her next piece began almost imperceptibly, a soft melody that wound its way through the room. It was delicate but purposeful, each note intentional. She let the music flow naturally, unrestrained by structure or expectation. Her fingers moved effortlessly across the keys, guided by years of practice and a deep connection to the instrument. Each chord, each trill, each pause carried meaning, a reflection of her inner world translated into sound. The hall seemed to breathe with her. The rich timbre of the piano filled every corner, vibrating subtly against the polished wood floors. She did not play fast or flashy. There was no rush. She allowed the music to unfold slowly, giving the audience time to notice the smallest inflections, the quiet shifts in tone that carried the weight of her story. Some leaned forward instinctively, as if drawn to the sound by a force they could not name. Others closed their eyes, surrendering to the music, letting it wash over them without resistance. The first few measures created an unusual kind of tension in the room, not one of nervousness or discomfort, but a deep, unspoken curiosity. Everyone present had heard countless performances before, but this was different. It was human, raw, unpolished in a way that made it real. She could feel their collective attention, but she did not let it control her. She played for herself and for the music, trusting that the audience would understand in their own way as the piece progressed. The melody grew bolder, intertwining with subtle harmonies that created layers of emotion. Each section flowed seamlessly into the next, as if the music itself had a life independent of her, guiding her hands along a path only she could follow. Some audience members began to recognize familiar patterns, echoes of songs they had loved or pieces they had performed themselves. But even these echoes were transformed, imbued with a depth and intensity that made them new. A man in the back, who had initially seemed dismissive, now leaned forward, his eyes wide with surprise. He whispered to his neighbor, barely audible, "How? How is she doing that?" His question hung in the air, unspoken by the others who were equally captivated. No one had the answer. The technique was flawless. Yes, but it was the emotion, the authenticity, the unmistakable presence of a person who had lived through her music that made it extraordinary. The tempo shifted slightly, subtle and deliberate. She allowed the music to breathe, creating moments of silence that were almost as powerful as the notes themselves. These pauses were not empty. They carried meaning, reflection, anticipation. The audience felt it instinctively. Some leaned back, absorbing the quiet tension. Others rested their hands over their hearts, overwhelmed by the intimacy of the moment. Even those who prided themselves on composure found themselves caught in the ebb and flow of sound. She thought of all the quiet mornings spent alone at the piano, when no one was there to listen or judge. She remembered the evenings when her fingers bled and her back ached from hours of practice. She thought of the moments when she had doubted herself, when the world seemed to close doors at every turn. And yet every one of those struggles had led her here. Every moment had contributed to the depth of expression she could now share. The audience had no idea, but it was present in every note, as the music grew more complex, demanded attention without demanding effort. She allowed her emotions to shape the phrasing, the dynamics, the subtle shifts that gave the piece life. The audience responded unconsciously. Their breathing synchronized with the rhythm. Their hearts felt the weight of the melodies. Their minds replayed memories they had long forgotten. The music was a mirror, reflecting both her story and theirs, blending experience and feeling into a shared moment that transcended spoken words. A young woman near the aisle, who had arrived skeptical, now had tears in her eyes. She tried to look composed, to hide her reaction, but it was impossible. The music had touched something deep within her, something that words could not reach. She clutched her chest lightly, as if holding on to a fragile truth that had suddenly surfaced. Around her, others experienced similar reactions, quiet sobs, tightened jaws, shallow breaths, all manifestations of the impact the performance had on them. She did not notice them directly. Her focus was absolute, entirely on the piano and the story she was telling through sound. She allowed herself to feel fully, letting the music carry not only her own emotions, but also the collective weight of the room. The grand hall, with its polished surfaces and sophisticated audience, became a vessel for something far more human and intimate than anyone had anticipated. The melody took on a more urgent tone, moving through rapid passages that demanded precision and clarity. Her fingers danced across the keys effortlessly, each movement fluid, natural, and expressive. The audience sensed the intensity without understanding the technical mastery behind it. They only knew that the sound resonated deeply, vibrating in ways they had not expected. Eyes widened, breaths caught, and for a moment, the entire hall seemed suspended in the music. Someone whispered, barely audible, She feels it." Ow. The words spread silently, like a ripple, through those seated nearby. They realized that this was not just performance. This was living, breathing music. Every gesture, every note, every pause carried intention and authenticity. It was impossible to fake, impossible to replicate. They were witnessing not only skill, but life itself distilled into sound. The pianist shifted seamlessly into a softer passage, a delicate motif that seemed to float above the heavier chords that had come before. It was intimate, almost fragile, yet strong in its honesty. She played as if the piano were an extension of herself, each key a channel for emotions that had waited years to be expressed. The room leaned into the sound collectively, as if held by an invisible thread woven from the music itself. A man in the front row, previously indifferent, now had a hand pressed to his lips, silent in astonishment. He had seen countless performances in his life, judged many musicians, and attended numerous prestigious events. Yet this moment was unlike anything he had experienced. He realized that it was not the complexity of the music alone that moved him, but the unmistakable truth in every note, the proof that the pianist had lived every emotion she was conveying. The tempo shifted again, this time with a sense of quiet urgency. The music rose and fell like waves, building and retreating in a rhythm that felt natural and inevitable. Each crescendo carried the weight of experience, each diminuendo offered space for reflection. The audience felt it in their bodies as much as in their ears. Some held on to the edges of their seats, others closed their eyes, lost in the ebb and flow of sound that seemed to speak directly to their souls. She allowed the final section to unfold slowly, deliberately. The music became expansive, filling the hall with a richness that was impossible to ignore. It was bold without being loud, expressive without being excessive. She had found a balance between restraint and freedom, allowing every note to breathe while maintaining the integrity of the piece. The audience leaned forward collectively, caught in the grip of something far greater than technical skill or fame. When the last notes approached, she slowed her hands, letting the chords stretch gently. The resonance lingered in the air, soft and profound. For a moment, the room held its collective breath, reluctant to release the spell that had been cast. Then, finally, the music faded completely, leaving a silence that was heavy with meaning. The audience sat, unmoving, absorbing the weight of what they had just witnessed. It was a silence filled with awe, reflection, and the unspoken acknowledgement that they had seen something extraordinary. They had arrived expecting a performance to judge, to critique, perhaps to enjoy politely. Instead, they had been confronted with something far more powerful: human emotion translated into sound. Raw and unfiltered, undeniable and unforgettable. The applause began slowly, almost hesitant, as if no one dared believe it was real. Then it grew, spreading through the room like a wave, louder and more insistent with each passing second. Hands clapped, feet tapped, voices cheered softly, and tears were wiped quietly from eyes that could not help but be moved. The elite, the critics, the experienced audience members all were compelled to acknowledge the truth in what they had just heard. She rose from the piano quietly, letting the sound of the applause wash over her without claiming it as her own. She did not smile. She did not bow excessively. She simply acknowledged it with a quiet nod, a gesture of gratitude, and stepped back from the instrument. The performance had been for the music, for the truth it carried, not for recognition. And yet, in that recognition, she understood something profound. She had reached them. She had spoken without words, told her story, and left an imprint that would remain far longer than the applause. The room hummed with quiet energy as people reflected on what they had witnessed. Conversations began again, but they were different now. The polite judgment had been replaced by curiosity, respect, and a lingering sense of wonder. They spoke of the performance in hushed tones, sharing their astonishment, comparing experiences, and acknowledging silently that they had underestimated the quiet woman who had played without expectation, without pretense, and yet had captivated them completely. The hall was quiet for a moment, a silence so complete that it felt almost sacred. Her hands had lifted from the keys, but the resonance of her final notes still hung in the air, a gentle echo that seemed to linger long after the music had ended. She stood back from the piano, calm and composed, as though nothing extraordinary had occurred. But everyone in the room knew differently. They had come expecting a performance, a moment to evaluate, perhaps to applaud politely, and yet what they had experienced was far beyond any expectation. They had carried some people were still frozen in their seats. Their faces betrayed disbelief, shock, and admiration, all at once. A man in the front row, someone who had spent years critiquing performances, sat with his mouth slightly open, eyes wide. He had seen countless musicians play in halls far grander than this, but none had ever affected him in this way. He realized, slowly, that it was not technical skill alone that moved him, but the undeniable humanity that had flowed from her through the piano. Each note had felt like a confession, a story lived rather than rehearsed, and it had pierced through the layers of skepticism he carried so confidently. Around him, others were experiencing similar reactions. A woman near the center of the room clutched the arm of her chair, her eyes glistening with tears she did not bother to hide. She had attended events like this many times, had seen musicians praised, critiqued, and celebrated, but she had never felt so completely held by music before. It was as though the pianist had reached past the surface, past the polished expectations of the evening, and touched something essential inside everyone present. Whispers began to circulate. Quiet at first, almost conspiratorial. "Who is she?" One person murmured. "I don't know," another replied. "I've never seen her perform before. Has anyone?" There were shake of heads and expressions of disbelief. The room had been filled with people who considered themselves knowledgeable, experienced, even elite, yet in that moment they were uncertain, humbled, and unprepared. No one could answer the simple question of who she was or where such depth of emotion had come from. She did not respond. She did not need to. Her presence, quiet as it was, had already spoken more loudly than words ever could. She allowed herself a small, steadying breath, feeling the release that had followed the music. For years she had carried moments like this inside her, small victories, private triumphs, nights when she had practiced in solitude until her fingers were raw. Her back ached, and the world seemed far away. And now, in a room full of people who had judged her before they even knew her, her music had done the talking. The applause began slowly, hesitant, as if the audience were testing reality, trying to believe that what they had just experienced was true. Then it grew, building in waves, louder and more insistent with each passing second. People rose from their seats, some standing immediately, some slowly, overwhelmed by the performance. Hands clapped, feet tapped, voices cheered softly, and tears were wiped quietly from eyes that could not help but be moved. The room was alive in a way it had never been before. She felt it without needing to acknowledge it overtly. It was not a victory in the traditional sense. She did not seek admiration or validation. She had no desire to prove herself to the people in the room, and yet, paradoxically, that was exactly what had happened. The audience had underestimated her, judged her by appearances, dismissed her as inconsequential. And in return, she had given them something undeniable, something that left them speechless. The performance had stripped away pretense, expectation, and ego, leaving only truth. Some guests began to murmur among themselves, voices quiet and careful. "I didn't expect that at all," one man said. She played like she was telling her life story. A woman nodded beside him, her eyes still glistening. "It's not just skill," she said softly. "It's emotion. Real emotion. You can't fake that." Others around them nodded in agreement, all processing the same truth in their own way. The elite, the critics, the experienced listeners, all had been confronted by something raw and human, something they had never anticipated and could not easily categorize. Even the performers who had come before her felt the impact. They had stepped away from the stage, confident in their abilities, sure of their technique, accustomed to receiving polite recognition, and yet, after her performance, they seemed diminished, as if they had glimpsed something they had never achieved. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, others whispered to themselves, recalibrating their understanding of music, talent, and presence. No one could deny that they had witnessed something extraordinary. She could feel the weight of their attention, but she did not let it distract her. Her focus remained inward, calm, centered. She had played for herself and for the music, and the audience had merely been fortunate enough to witness it. That was always her way. Recognition was never the goal. Expression was the goal. And tonight, the music had carried her completely, allowing her to be seen, in a way without the need for words or explanation. Slowly, people began to approach the piano. Some were organizers, moving with quiet efficiency to ensure the evening continued. Others were guests, curious, hesitant, wanting to catch a glimpse of the woman who had captured the room so completely. There were polite nods, soft words of admiration, and subtle glances of newfound respect. But she did not rush to speak or respond. She simply acknowledged them with a quiet nod, as if to say that her performance had spoken enough. Words were unnecessary. A man in the back row, previously dismissive, now stood with his hand pressed to his chest, his eyes wide. "I have never," he began, then paused, struggling to find words. The music had left him momentarily speechless, stripped of the confidence he had carried so easily moments before. Around him, others shared similar reactions. The experience had reached them all in ways that were profound and unmistakable. Her eyes scanned the room, noticing the subtle shifts in posture, the softened expressions, the tentative gestures of acknowledgement. People were no longer judging her. They were no longer comparing, evaluating, or dismissing. They were simply present, experiencing, and absorbing the weight of the moment. It was an unusual, almost magical transformation. She had not intended to command attention. She had intended only to play, yet in doing so, she had changed the room, the audience, and perhaps even the way they viewed music itself. Some people approached hesitantly, wanting to offer words of praise. "That was incredible," one whispered. "I have never felt music like that before," another added. You have a way of speaking through the piano. It's alive." She accepted their words quietly, with calm grace, as if the performance had been enough and no further acknowledgement was required. The impact of her music did not need embellishment. It was complete in itself. A few guests lingered, looking at her with a mixture of curiosity and newfound respect. They had been certain that they understood what talent looked like, how a performer should present themselves, what a successful performance entailed. And yet in front of them stood someone who had shattered their assumptions without raising her voice, without drawing attention, and without claiming recognition. Her presence was quiet, but her music had spoken loudly. Even the critics, who had arrived with careful, measured expressions, seemed humbled. Their pens paused mid-note, their whispers ceased, their eyes softened. They had been expecting routine evaluations, rehearsed critiques, polite commentary. Instead, they had been confronted by authenticity, depth, and an emotional resonance that they could not categorize or dismiss. Some scribbled hurried notes, others simply watched in awe, realizing that this was a moment they would remember long after the evening ended. The pianist allowed herself a small, calm smile as she stepped away from the piano. She did not rush, did not bow excessively, and did not seek further validation. Her performance had been its own statement. The applause continued, growing and echoing through the hall, but she felt no need to claim it. She had spoken through the music, and that was enough. The audience had seen her in a way and had been moved beyond judgment, expectation, or comparison. People began to reflect silently and aloud on what they had just witnessed. Conversations resumed, but they were different. No more thoughtful, more reflective, more human. Guests spoke quietly about the emotional power of the performance, the honesty in every note, and the skill that had been seamlessly married to feeling. Some discussed technique, others focused on emotion. But all were united in a shared acknowledgement. They'd experienced something rare, something unforgettable, something that transcended the ordinary. She walked calmly toward the side of the hall, observing quietly as the audience processed the experience. There were no grand gestures, no need for applause to define her worth, no desire to assert herself. Her music had done all the work, and in that quiet dignity there was a lesson, unspoken but evident. True talent does not demand recognition. It does not announce itself. It simply exists, quietly, powerfully, and irrevocably. A young guest approached, eyes wide, trembling slightly. That was incredible," they whispered. "I have never heard anything like it." She nodded gently, acknowledging the words without embellishment. The truth of the performance needed no praise. It had reached everyone in the room, leaving an impression far deeper than any conversation or compliment could. As the night continued, atmosphere remained charged with unspoken realization. People had arrived expecting to witness music, but they had experienced something more: honesty, vulnerability, and the undeniable power of human expression. The pianist had not simply performed, she had transformed the room, changed perceptions, and left the audience with a quiet understanding of what true artistry could achieve.